So welcome everybody to the Risk Factors 101 webinar. Specifically today, we will be looking at what puts someone at risk for human trafficking. This webinar is brought to you by Rescue Us Mission, and we are really happy to have you watching today. So as we mentioned, this webinar is brought to you by Rescue Us Mission. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Houston, Texas. Your presenter of this webinar today is Natasha Eads. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Houston, and we wanted to tell you just a bit about Rescue Us. So we were established in 2017, and we provide a faith-based transitional care program for female survivors of human trafficking. And our transitional care program has two main components: the provision of safe and stable housing for our residents, and the implementation of our developmental activities. So these developmental activities include Bible study, mental health counseling, vocational training, and much more. It is our goal for survivors who undergo the Rescue Us program and who graduate from our program that our survivors are not only women who have just survived their trauma, but who are thriving in the fullness of who God has created them to be. And considering that Rescue Us serves the survivors of human trafficking, this brings us to our first question, which is, what is human trafficking? So we just want to give a brief overview of human trafficking, and we wanted to first start by noting that human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. And every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the United States. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. Traffickers might use a variety of tactics such as violence, manipulation, false promises of well-being or well-paying jobs, or romantic relationships to lure victims into trafficking situations. And traffickers look for people who are susceptible to trafficking for a variety of reasons. These reasons include psychological or emotional vulnerabilities, economic hardship, a lack of a social safety net, experiencing natural disasters, or political instability. And these susceptibilities are the particular risk factors that we will be diving more into detail later in this webinar. And we wanted to note that the trauma caused by the traffickers can be so great that many victims may not identify themselves as victims or ask for help, even in highly public settings. And although research and various trafficking expert organizations have noted that trafficking can happen to anyone, anywhere, research has attempted to identify some key factors that may put individuals at heightened risk for trafficking compared to someone who is not affected by these factors. So this leads us to our first question, which is, what puts a child or a minor at risk for human trafficking? And so based on the current and available research and other expert resources, such as the Department of Homeland Security, there are a few main categories that I have brought it to light for this particular webinar. So I've noted first that there are socioeconomic factors such as runaway or homelessness, experiencing poverty, a lack of personal safety, and living near a border. And so that last one is particularly relevant for international trafficking. And then there are also some family or social related factors such as promotion of sexual exploitation by family members or peers, family dysfunction, experiencing a lack of social support, and isolation. And that could be both physical isolation as well as maybe just social isolation. And so then lastly, we have some mental health and intellectual factors, as well as some behavioral factors. So substance abuse, experiencing mental illness, learning disabilities, experiencing developmental delay, and childhood physical or sexual abuse, as well as deficits in executive functioning in the brain, experiencing emotional distress, having an impulsive personality style or tending towards impulsivity, suicidal ideation, and then low self-esteem. And so this is a relatively long list, but is by no means an exhaustive list of factors that can put a child at risk for trafficking, and nor do one or more of these factors have to be present for a child to be trafficked. So a trafficking victim can be anyone, anywhere. These, however, are factors that have been identified as being more statistically associated with child or minor trafficking victimization. And so this brings us to our next question, which would be what puts an adult as compared to a child or minor at risk for trafficking? And the list for various risk factors that have been identified for adult trafficking victimization could be potentially very, very long. And so we have also not included an exhaustive list of adult risk factors in this webinar. However, these are just some of the main risk factors that stood out to me in the research and in the various just expert resources that I looked through. And so we have identified immigration status, specifically foreign national or undocumented status, as one important risk factor. Experiencing a history of maltreatment, neglect, abuse, and or trauma. Having a high ACE score, so an ACE score stands for adverse childhood experiences, and these are these could be a variety of experiences which were adverse that somebody experienced in their childhood. And it was found in one study not too long ago that having a high ACE score was associated with greater trafficking victimization and trafficking experience. And so also there's family dysfunction, social isolation, experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence, a lack of awareness about trafficking and its related topics or behaviors, gang involvement, experiencing peer pressure, being of homeless, runaway, or throwaway status, certain social norms as well, such as just social norms related to risky online and offline behaviors, for example, and then also experiencing low self-esteem. And so you may notice that some of these risk factors on this list are bold, and we bolded these risk factors because they overlap with the same risk factors that were identified for children/minors in the previous slide. And so ultimately, this just shows that there is overlap in the current literature about risk factors for trafficking victimization for children and adults. So there aren't always clear separate categories of risk factors that affect children and minors versus adults. However, as you can see, some of these risk factors that we noted for adults are not in bold. So there is just essentially a lot of different research and different risk factors that have been identified. And so the distinctions are not always clear. And I think this further supports the idea that trafficking victimization can happen to anyone, anywhere, but that research is trying to identify some factors that do maybe put an individual at heightened risk than certain other demographic factors that would not put someone at risk for trafficking. And so we found one 2019 research study that just confirmed this really well. And they said that pathways into the commercial sex industry for youth may be markedly different than pathways into the commercial sex industry for adults. So researchers suggest that there is no one clear pathway, but rather a combination of risk factors that create situations that lead to involvement in the commercial sex industry. So essentially, I think research is still at a place where they are working on identifying more clearly risk factors that may be different for children and adults, and just overall different risk factors for different specific groups. And so we did want to look specifically more into one particular research study that was conducted in 2014, and they researched risk factors for female human sex trafficking specifically. And so all of the research that they reported is from a sample of, I believe it was young adult and like adolescent females. So that is what their research is specific to, as well as specific to human sex trafficking and not necessarily for labor trafficking, although they did make some notes about human trafficking in general. And so They first found that female adolescents and young adults have the highest rates of recruitment, trafficking, and victimization in the sex trade. They also found that although the precise age range varies from study to study, the greatest risk of sexual victimization online is posed to female adolescents instead of young children, as previously suspected. So the previous thought was that in terms of sexual victimization online, the greatest demographic group that is at risk for experiencing that is just children in general, or specifically young children. But this study, based on their research results, is proposing that it's instead female adolescents who are at most risk for experiencing sexual victimization online rather than just children in general. And so overall, from the results that they found, female adolescents and young adults do emerge as a particularly at-risk group for trafficking victimization. And this is both trafficking victimization in general and also more specifically being trafficked via the internet or recruited for trafficking via the internet. And so with the advent of the age of just technology and internet use and social media, as well as noting that female adolescents and female young adults do have this higher risk for trafficking, these researchers wanted to look more specifically if there are any particular risk factors that would put one of these individuals at greater risk for trafficking, recruitment, and victimization on the internet. And so one of the risk factors that emerged from this research question and investigation was that the use of chat rooms and social networking sites is one online behavior that does put an individual in their sample at greater risk for trafficking via the internet. And also that online behaviors involving communicating with a stranger about sex, participating in chat rooms, posting personal information, using the internet at households other than their own, and visiting pornographic websites were all associated with an increased likelihood of sexual victimization. Additionally, increased amounts of problematic internet use was another important risk factor for online victimization that emerged from their study. And online victimization is overwhelmingly perpetrated against women. This was found from various studies conducted from 2007 to about 2011. And so overall, the sex of an individual appears to be strongly associated with their overall level of risk. And based on this information, I would also say that not only the sex of an individual, but the intersection of that female sex and the young adult or adolescent age status, it could be even the combination of those two factors together that would put an individual at an even heightened risk for victimization online. And so some other risk factors that they wanted to note from their study is that age may be an important risk factor for online victimization. Specifically, an age range of about 11 to 17 years old may put one, especially a female young adult or adolescent, at greater risk for online victimization. They also found some offline risky behaviors that were associated with online victimization. So an offline risk behavior is a behavior that is performed offline, but nonetheless is associated with greater trafficking victimization online. So interestingly, in this 2014 study, they found that increased marijuana consumption was a significant predictor of online victimization and trafficking, whereas alcohol, other drug, and tobacco use were not associated with an increased likelihood of online victimization. Dating violence and sex behaviors were not significant in predicting outcomes of online victimization either. So this finding about marijuana use is not only significant because just in general, it was found that marijuana use was associated with online victimization, but also that out of the offline risk behaviors that they evaluated, that marijuana use emerged as the strongest offline risk behavior predictor of human sex trafficking victimization on the internet. And so I think that is particularly surprising considering that the other offline behaviors that they looked at were dating violence, sex behaviors, alcohol use, things like that, that may be more traditionally associated with thinking that those would make someone more at risk for being trafficked online. And so I think that this is a particularly unique finding that warrants not only future research, but also just future focus in preventative efforts against trafficking. And so in addition to offline risk behaviors, they also identified some online risk behaviors for trafficking via the internet. So as the name implies, these are behaviors that are performed online and are then associated with greater risk for online victimization. And so in particular, this study found that participating in online dating and gambling behaviors were shown to be the strongest predictors of becoming sexually victimized on the internet when compared with other online risk behaviors. And these other online risk behaviors were contact with unknown users and content, increased social media use, and frequent risky interpersonal communication behaviors. And so overall, individuals in the study who engage in an elevated amount of risky online behaviors do have a higher chance of becoming a victim of human sex trafficking, but online dating and gambling were the strongest online behavioral risk factors in this study. And so I think that's another similarly unique finding. The online dating may feel a little less surprising, but online gambling may be unexpected compared to some of the other behaviors they looked at, such as the contact with unknown users and content. So I think both of these findings definitely deserve future research attention, as well as future attention in preventative efforts and campaigns against trafficking victimization. And so lastly, they also found that poor self-esteem was a predictor of the risk of being recruited and trafficked on the internet. And so I just felt that this was important to note of low self-esteem being a key risk factor for human trafficking, because we not only identified it earlier for children and minors, but we also identified low self-esteem as a risk factor for adults. And now this Miller 2014 study identified low self-esteem as being associated with greater risk for online trafficking victimization. So essentially, low self-esteem is continuously, time and again, emerging as an important risk factor. And so I think it definitely warrants future research and investigation, as well as definite attention and focus in terms of preventative efforts and campaigns in terms of wanting to prevent trafficking victimization, especially in young adults and young female adults and adolescents. And so we wanted to note as well that after these demographic factors that we have identified from this 2014 study, there were some other demographic, or rather other demographic commonalities for victimization on the internet became less clear. And so I just felt that that further supports that we can identify some key risk factors, and these definitely deserve future attention. But we just wanted to reiterate that trafficking can happen to anyone, and it can happen anywhere. And so as we close out this webinar, we definitely felt that we should address just the question of what can we do in response to this information. What can we do both as a community and as individuals who are interested in this topic? And so firstly, and from that 2014 study, they suggested that we can involve parental authorities just in this topic, and particularly in adolescents, access to particular websites and social media platforms and things of that nature. We can also all together and individually create, participate in, and share awareness and informative campaigns about trafficking. And so these campaigns should target perspectives about online activities, not just which sites to avoid. So for example, one campaign approach may be to inform participants not only of risky websites to avoid visiting, but also reshape participants' perspective on the connection between their risky online and offline behaviors and the subsequent greater risk for trafficking victimization. We can also inform adolescents about the dangers of risky sexual behaviors, both online, such as posting provocative images on the web, and offline risk behaviors as well, such as marijuana use, which we identified earlier. And so I think that this also just connects to what we noted previously about targeting perspectives. So not just wanting to identify key behaviors or just sites to avoid, but also helping adolescents to understand, adolescents and young adults to understand the connections between their behaviors and subsequent consequences, which can sometimes be very difficult for adolescents and young adults to understand. And so this 2014 study definitely confirmed that and really brought that home in a quote that that I took from their study, which says that adolescents and young adults may not be aware of or believe that the consequences of online risk behavior can be as real and as unforgiving as certain offline risk behaviors. In many cases, the consequences of online risk behavior can have lingering and longer lasting effects. These findings speak to the importance of alerting female adolescents and young adults about the dangers that lurk online and the risks that result from seemingly harmless interactions or behaviors on the internet. We also wanted to note that watching future Rescue Us community awareness events is a great way to stay up to date on human trafficking topics, and a great way to also not just acquire this information and awareness for yourself, but to then be able to share this information that you've learned with your friends and family, just on your social media or anywhere else that it may feel beneficial, because we wanted to note that a big part of preventing trafficking and just informing people about trafficking really relies on individuals sharing important information, not just organizations doing big awareness events or big public safety announcements on TV or something, but it can be so helpful and so important for individuals like us to simply share links to webinars or share articles that we've read on human trafficking and really do that peer-to-peer sharing of information. And as we noted earlier, one of the risk factors for trafficking that emerged was a lack of awareness about trafficking itself and its related topics. So simply spreading that awareness on an individual basis is a lot more powerful and impactful than it may feel. And lastly, we definitely wanted to suggest prayer. John 14 verses 13 through 14 specifically say, whatever you ask, and this is Jesus speaking, whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. And he said, if you ask me anything in my name, I will do it, in those verses. So we just wanted to reiterate that prayer is very, very powerful. It is a definite way that we as God's people can intercede on behalf of those who are being trafficked, those who don't know about trafficking, and things of that nature, those who are at risk for trafficking. So we just wanted to encourage that prayer is something that we can do anytime, anywhere, and that the Lord encourages us to pray and intercede for those who are in need of prayer, and for just this world, and for God's will to be done in the lives of everyone affected by this. So we just wanted to then go ahead and share the sources for the information from this study, as it's definitely important to share where we're getting our information, especially since a lot of this came from research articles specifically. So this is just the rest of the list of our sources for the information in this webinar. And we wanted to thank you for joining us. And we wanted to note that this webinar should be on YouTube as well as our website, and that we have some informative resources that we can share if anyone would like to contact us via email, just some articles that we can point you to or anything that you may have questions about. And our email is rescueusmission@gmail.com, or you could also email info@rescueusmission.org. And lastly, if you would like to support Rescue Us Mission, particularly supporting us being able to continue to share these community awareness events, and as well as directly supporting just the care for our survivors that we also do as an organization, then you can make a donation via the donate button on our website, which is www.rescueusmission.org. So we wanted to thank you so much for watching this community awareness webinar. We are praying that this information has empowered you, and that it's brought your attention to something that you were not aware of. And we just really wanted to thank you for your time and encourage you to share the link to this video, or just share anything that you've learned in any way that you can with your community members, because again, there's a lot of power in that peer-to-peer raising awareness. So thank you, and we're praying that you just have a blessed day, and we will see you at our next community awareness webinar.